As China's defense minister visits India, there are hopes that the tensions over last year's border standoff are finally fading. How are the two neighbors stepping up their cooperation? And after the U.S. imposes yet more sanctions against Russia, how will Moscow react? And what hope is there for the better relationship between the two that U.S. President Donald Trump had so assiduously espoused over the last few months? Welcome to The Point. Live from Beijing, I'm Li Xin. China's defense minister is in India, the first such visit in 6 years. State Councillor and Defense Minister Wei Fenghe arrived on Tuesday on a 4-day visit. The Chinese Ministry of National Defense said that the two sides were exchanging opinions on issues of common concern, resolving borders tensions and enhancing trust and communication. After the border standoff in the Donglang region last year that lasted over 70 days, Chinese President Xi Jinping and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi met in Wuhan in central China in April. That meeting set in motion conscious attempts by both sides to put differences aside and, quote, unquote, enter a new chapter in their relations. The Defense Ministry also said that both militaries are actively fulfilling the consensus reached during the Wuhan summit. So how will the two militaries overcome differences and work together? And how will Sino-Indian military ties influence geopolitical relations in the region? Joining me for the discussion from New Delhi is Ashok Mehta, a former Major General in the Indian Army, and in Beijing, Professor Zhu Chenghu from the National Defense University of the People's Liberation Army. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Professor Zhu, let me go to you first. Now, General Wei's India visit is also the Chinese minister's first such visit to India in 6 years. What's the significance of that visit to the military relationship as well as bilateral ties, and what could be some issues topping the agenda for both sides?
First of all, I believe that the visit by General Wei to India is a manifestation of the rapprochement between China and India following the confrontation in Dockland last year. Secondly, I believe that this shows that both sides are willing to carry out security and military cooperations in different fields. And thirdly, I believe the two militaries and two countries have witnessed their responsibilities in the turbulent world today.
So, Mr. Mehta, let me go to you. Last year during the standoff, you were guest of our show, and that piece of discussion also went viral on the Chinese social media as the audiences on both sides were paying a lot of attention to the discussion. Now, a few months later, almost a year later, what kind of improvement have you observed in the relationship between the two militaries?
Well, first of all, the visit of your defense minister to India, I believe, is a new beginning in defense relations between two big countries, between two big armies. So I think it's a stepping stone towards a new direction if everything holds good. And everything will hold good because of what you described. What I feel is was the turning point after Donglang, or Dolam as we call it. That was the summit at Wuhan. The summit at Wuhan did a great deal to remove misperceptions, differences, difficulties, and where it was said that we should not allow differences to convert into disputes, and disputes convert into conflict. And I think both leaders, the President Xi and Prime Minister Modi, have demonstrated the higher standards of leadership in arresting the downslide at Doklam and, as I said, turned the corner and come with this outstanding visit by Defense Minister Wei. I believe he met our Prime Minister yesterday, and the Prime Minister told him that India-China relations are a factor of stability in international and global relations.
Well,
he also talked about the maturity and the sensitivity with which two sides have been able to maintain peace and tranquility on the border. So overall, the defense minister is leading a 24-member delegation, a very high-powered delegation with members of your Central Military Commission, International Cooperation Division.
Right.
And therefore, I think this is a very important step.
Indeed,
in
it's a very
defense relations.
Right. Indeed, it's a very promising step, and it's good that the militaries of the two countries are talking. However, on a technical side, Professor Zhu, what are some of the challenges that has to be overcome by both sides? For instance, on the Chinese side, in order to improve relations with the Indian military, what do the Chinese military have to work on at this moment?
At present, I think in the mirror-to-mirror ties, there are some challenges. Number one is actually the disputes over the territory on the border. I think it's advisable for us to shelve the dispute and to put forward the cooperation in the security and the military fields. Secondly, I believe that we are short of trust, especially the strategic trust, because of the long differences, disputes, etc. And third is that the media of both sides will have to play a constructive role. Unfortunately, I don't think the media on both sides played this sort of constructive role. Instead, they played very negative role in publicizing some information on the other side. This is very important challenges for us. Of course, by improving the relations, for the further improvement of the relations between the two countries, I believe dialogues are very important. Like the visit paid is being paid to India by General Wei, and of course we need also talks between the scholars and the exchanges between the different
you talked about
people,
Professor Zhu, you talked about shelving the difference in terms of the border issue. However, do you think the border issue can be shelved for long term? Are there plans between the two sides to really work out some kind of mechanism for better coordination, such as a hotline or some other permanent solution, as some Indian press are quoting, to resolve this issue so that a similar situation wouldn't repeat itself in the future?
Of course, resolution of the disputes or the differences over the border is very important for both sides. But unfortunately, I don't think it is possible for us to address this dispute in a short period of time. Therefore, I believe that at present stage, I think it is the best way for us to do is to shelve the disputes. If we look at history, we can see that in the past several decades, there is even not a single shoot across the border. I believe this is the foundation. I believe this is actually materialized because of different mechanisms between China and India. Actually, we have a lot of CBMs on border, and of course, we need to increase this sort of CBMs and establish new mechanisms on the basis of negotiation and talks.
Okay, from the perspective of India, now Prime Minister Modi on Tuesday virtually dismissed the opposition Congress clamour over reports about China's continued military build-up in and around Donglong. So, Mr. Mehta, from the Indian perspective, what has to happen if such border friction is not to flare up again? And to what extent will domestic political pressure hinder China-India military ties, or will it?
You see, first of all, the two sides must, as the professor said, inculcate a greater degree of trust between the two militaries. and a lot of new confidence-building measures have to be instituted. That measure of trust is necessary because not only have India and China fought a war in 1962, we've had a series of spats on the so-called boundary question. The problem today is that you have a line of actual control. There is an Indian perception of the line of actual control. There is an Indian perception of the Chinese perception of the line of actual control. There is a Chinese perception of the line of actual control, and there is a Chinese perception of the Indian perception of the line of actual control. Do forgive me if I have made this very complicated, but this is a problem which creates situations on the border like Debsang in 2013, like Chumar in 2014, when President Xi was very much in India. There were about 300 soldiers in Chumar, which created this problem. And so something has to be done about demarcation of the line of actual control till the boundary question. I agree with the professor that you need more time, you need greater trust, you need better public opinion,
right,
because time has changed. When it was opportune to have a border settlement, we didn't do it.
Okay.
And therefore we have to now create greater trust.
It's going to take some time.
Get on. In the meantime, yes, it's certainly going to take time, and we must maintain the peace and tranquility on the border and create the sense of confidence between the two militaries.
It's true, and I think that's exactly
happening.
That's exactly
through
why
military exercises.
Yeah, exactly. And you mentioned these military exercises.
Yes, by the visit.
Yeah, I want to also mention that on Wednesday the Shanghai Cooperation
hand-in-hand exercise,
peace mission exercise. It kicks off in
tomorrow.
Russia. Yeah, India has joined the drill alongside Pakistan, and this year China may also resume the hand-in-hand bilateral military exercise with India. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but time is really limited. The hand-in-hand bilateral military exercises with India, which was cancelled last year. So, Professor Zhu, what kind of prospects are we looking really for a new chapter of military ties between the two countries?
I think in the new chapter, both sides will have to increase cooperations, including the security cooperation and the military cooperations. Actually, we had some cooperations like the exercise you mentioned just now, Xin. And in the future, I believe that we are, China and India are facing similar security challenges like terrorist challenges, like the reshaping of the world order, including the security order, etc., like the tranquility and stability, not only on Sino-Indian border, but also in Indian Ocean and South China Sea. On all of these issues, China and India can cooperate. I believe this sort of cooperation will be very conducive to the maintenance of stability and the peace in the region.
And being the two biggest countries in this part of the world, I guess we must cooperate, right? Otherwise, indeed, the stability of this region will be at risk. Many thanks to my two guests, Ashok Mehta, a former Major General in the Indian Army, and in Beijing, Professor Zhu Chengku from the National Defense University of the People's Liberation Army. You have been watching The Point with me, Liu Xin. We'll take a short break, and when I come back, I'll be asking if the special ties that U.S. President Donald Trump had been nurturing with Russian President Vladimir Putin have been consigned to the waste bin of history. Stay with me. The US has imposed fresh sanctions on Russia after determining it used a nerve agent against a former Russian double agent living in the UK. Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia were left seriously ill after being poisoned with the nerve agent Novichok in March, though they have now recovered. A UK investigation blamed Russia for the attack, but the Kremlin denied any involvement. Russia has criticized the new U.S. sanctions as draconian. The announcement of restrictions sent the ruble tumbling to a two-year low and drew a stern warning from its Prime Minister Medvedev. And to avoid Moscow's woes, the Trump administration has now also announced another series of sanctions targeting Russia because of ships that are delivering Russian oil to North Korea, or DPRK, despite ongoing sanctions. Why is Washington taking this action now, some 5 months after the Skripal attack, and what will be the likely fallout on President Trump's hopes for a better relationship with Moscow? Joining me from Washington are Ivan Eland, a senior fellow at the Independent Institute, and from London, Alexander Nekrasov, a former Kremlin advisor. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Mr. Eland, let me go to you first. As I mentioned, 5 months after the Skripal case in March in London, the U.S. decided to impose sanctions on Russia over the case. Why now?
Well, I think, the administration is trying to forestall more stringent sanctions that the Congress seems to be more inclined to put on, since they just discovered that there were hacking attempts against two conservative think tanks and the U.S. Senate. So I think the administration is trying to forestall more serious sanctions from the Congress.
Do they have any evidence, so what is the basis of their decision making? Is it because the UK government shared with them their evidence, their sources of information, which they have built the conclusion that Russia was behind this attack? Mr. Eland.
Yes, well, I'm sure they have shared that information. And I think that's the United States is, of course, a NATO ally with Britain, and Britain is the closest ally traditionally to the U.S. of any other country in the world, really. And so I think there was also impetus to show solidarity with Britain, since this happened on British soil. Also, the Russians seem to have broken an unwritten code among spies. If spies are exchanged or are living peacefully after the fact of being a spy, they're supposed to be left alone. But I think that in this case the Russians may have gone overboard, and Putin seems to want to eliminate anyone who he sees as a traitor. So the UK certainly thinks that the Russians have gone beyond this unwritten rule of live and let live.
Well, Mr. Eland,
among
yeah.
Former spies.
Mr. Eland, those were the opinion of the U.S. administration, or do you personally buy into these?
Well, I think Russia probably did it. I mean, who else has Novichok? And I think they probably, that's a serious problem. I mean, they could do that here in the United States as well.
Okay. Mr. Nekrasov, do you have questions to ask Mr. Eland? I guess you do.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say there is no proof of anything, so I don't even know what to ask. The investigation into the so-called poisoning by Novichok provided nothing, no proof at all. To be honest with you, I don't understand why this sudden introduction of these sanctions in response to that poisoning. But what people in Moscow do understand, the Kremlin, is that this is a reflection of the political struggle going in Washington. The president is basically opposed by Congress, by the renegades in the intelligence community, by most of the media in America. This battle is fierce. Somebody is trying to win at some point, somebody is trying to win at another point. These sanctions are obviously not hurting Russia. And
before we go into
the
the effects of these sanctions, Mr. Nekrasov, you said that there is absolutely no evidence against supporting the theory that the Russian government is behind the attack. Well, the UK government says they have different sources of information which have shared information with them, pointing finger to the Russian government, but simply because of the nature of these sources that they're not able to release these sources. So it seems that there are evidences, it's just that the UK government cannot share with the public, and we cannot know them.
Well, unfortunately, this won't work in this case. In this case, there was such a huge political and diplomatic row. You can't really claim that you have sources, but you can't quote them, and you can't reveal anything, but you know. This doesn't work like this. Unfortunately, the British intelligence and British government has a very bad track record of lying and misleading the world opinion. Remember Iraq, remember Libya, remember Syria. I mean, the list is so long, they've lied so much that I'm sorry, I can't buy this. And they have to show proof. There is no proof at all.
Yeah, Mr. Eland.
And this is why I think that, you know, these sanctions to be introduced because of the poisoning doesn't work like this. This is a political struggle in Washington, and you know, that's how it works.
Okay. Mr. Eland, how do you counter that? Because basically in your beginning opening answers, you used a lot of words like probably, it seems, it appears, they must have, you know, and my question really is, we do not know, right? The UK government probably has the evidences, but we do not know for sure. How can you prove that Russia is guilty before you move ahead with these sanctions? Are we going to do things like this in the world from now on? Or continue to do things like this?
Well, we always do. Nations do that. We don't have a court of law for most things in international affairs, so you really don't have to prove it in a court of law beyond a reasonable doubt, as we would have to do in a court here in the United States. What you have to do is develop evidence with intelligence agencies, and I mean, it's pretty glaring that this substance was made by the Russian government, and there was the only people that made it, right? So there's a big hint right there. So I don't think we have to prove it in court, but there's enough evidence to show that the Russians might have done this, and I also think there's a lot of evidence to show that the Russians hacked the U.S. election, which is a glaring problem as well. Now, I'm not usually in favor of economic sanctions because I don't think they have the desired political effect. Now, they can put economic pressure on various countries, but to get them to do what you want to politically, which is the end goal of the economic penalties, is rare. But I think, you know, the West has to do something when the Russians are cyber attacking and you know, doing these chemical attacks. But I'm all for having a better long-term relationship with Russia, but I think we have to get over these the continuing cyber attacks on the U.S. that are occurring in this election cycle too.
Right. Well, again, we're looking at allegations or claims that Russia meddled in those elections, and that the report by Microsoft pointed to some Russian influence behind the, you know, some websites being targeting conservative think tanks. Again, this is just one report by one company. Is the U.S. government determined to make its policy based on these information?
Well, that one company operates the forum and the medium on which these attacks occurred, so they discovered it. So I guess you probably have to take their word for it that they discovered it. But you know, the Russians can.
Do you think that the
Russians can keep clouding it up and saying that this isn't true? But there's certainly an awful lot of allegations out there. And like I said, the U.S. government can put sanctions on Russia. Whether they can prove it in court or not, but of course the special counsel has indicted many Russians on the cyber attacks of the election.
Do you think these elections will succeed in changing the Russian behavior, though, Mr. Eland?
No, I think they should have taken stronger actions, and I think the Congress is going to take stronger actions. And I think, unfortunately, sometimes when countries have bad relations, some things need to be done. I'm not usually for sanctions, but in the case of attacking the U.S. elections are a lot more important in the United States than they are in Russia, and they know that that's the core of our system, and so it's an attack on our country, and we do have to do something about it.
Mr. Nekrasov, whether or not Russia has done these things, it is being accused of having done these things, and whether or not it has done, punishment is coming wave after wave, as we said. Right now, these are some sanctions, and then if Russia does not comply, there will be more sanctions, more draconian sanctions in 90 days. Should Russia be worried about what's going to happen further down the line?
Well, first of all, I'd like to make one point very quickly. American government accuses Russia of meddling in U.S. elections. Now, let me remind you that the American government controls all the social media platforms, Microsoft and others. Please, let's not play this game of saying, oh, they're all independent, oh, they do what they want. I'm sorry, it doesn't work like this. We have ample proof that the CIA, the Pentagon, and the NSA control these mediums. So please, let's remember this when they try to convince us that Russia manipulates that huge mechanism. Secondly, the Kremlin understands the problem that Trump has. Trump is playing a difficult game. We can see by the latest developments how pressure is building on him. So he has to play along with the forces in Washington that are trying to basically destroy relations with Russia. Let's put it this way. Now, will it hurt Russia? Well, of course it will. I mean, sanctions are introduced in order to cause damage. But will Russia find a way around them? Of course it will. Like it did for many, many years, by the way, even when the Soviet Union had sanctions introduced against it. Because there will be other sources of the same products. Russia is developing its own base, and that is not the end of the world. But the behavior of the American government is appalling. Absolutely appalling.
We have to leave it there.
They are destroying their cred in the world for good.
We have to leave it there. Many thanks to my two guests, Ivan Eland, a senior fellow at the Independent Institute, and Alexander Nekrasov, a former Kremlin advisor, joining us from London. And that's it for this edition of The Point. Follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with Alex. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.